The Tale of Little Pig Robinson, Chapter 5. Old Mr. Mumby was a deaf old man in spectacles who kept a general store. He sold almost anything you can imagine except ham, a circumstance much approved by Aunt Dorcas. It was the only general store in Stymouth where you could not find, displayed upon the counter, a large dish containing strings of thin, pale-colored, repulsively uncooked sausages and rolled bacon hanging from the ceiling. "What pleasure," said Aunt Dorcas feelingly. "What possible pleasure can there be in entering a shop where you knock your head against a ham that may have belonged to a dear second cousin?" Therefore the aunts bought their sugar and tea, their blue bag, their soap, their frying pans, matches, and mugs from old Mr. Mumby. All these things he sold, and many more besides, and what he did not keep in stock he would obtain to order. But yeast requires to be quite fresh. He did not sell it. He advised Robinson to ask for yeast at a baker's shop. Also, he said it was too late in the season to buy cabbage seed. Everybody had finished sowing vegetable seeds this year. Worsted for darning he did sell, but Robinson had forgotten the color. Robinson bought 6 sticks of delightfully sticky barley sugar with his pennies and listened carefully to Mr. Mumby's messages for Aunt Dorcas and Aunt Porcus, how they were to send some cabbages next week when the donkey cart would be mended, and how the kettle was not yet prepared, and there was a new patent box iron he would like to recommend to Aunt Porcus. There's Mumby's. Robinson said, "Wee, wee, wee," and listened, and little dog Tipkins, who stood on a stool behind the counter, tying up grocery parcels in blue paper bags, little dog Tipkins whispered to Robinson, "Were there any rats this spring in the barn at Piggery Porcombe, and what would Robinson be doing on Saturday afternoon?" "Wee, wee, wee," answered Robinson. Robinson came out of Mr. Mumby's, heavily laden. The barley sugar was comforting, but he was troubled about the darning wool, the yeast, and the cabbage seed. He was looking about rather anxiously when again he met old Betsy, who exclaimed, "Bless the little piggy, not gone home yet. Now it must not stop in Stymouth till it gets its pockets picked." Robinson explained his difficulty about the darning wool. Kind old Betsy was ready with help. "Why, I noticed the wool round the little primrose posy. It was blue-grey colour like the last pair of socks that I knitted for Sam. Come with me to the wool shop, Fleecy Flock's wool shop. I remember the colour, well I do," said Betsy. Mrs. Flock was the sheep that had run against Robinson. She had bought herself 3 turnips and come straight home from market, for fear of missing customers while her shop was locked up. Such a shop, such a jumble! Wool, all sorts of colours, thick wool, thin wool, fingering wool, and rug wool, bundles and bundles all jumbled up, and she could not put her hoof on anything. She was so confused and slow at finding things that Betsy got impatient. "No, I don't want wool for slippers. Darning wool, fleecy, darning wool, same colour as I bought for my Sam's socks." "Bless me, no, not knitting needles, darning wool." "Bah, bah, did you say white or black, ma'am? 3-ply, was it? Oh dear me, grey darning wool on cards, not heather mixture. I know I have it somewhere," said Fleecy Flock, helplessly jumbling up the skeins and bundles. "Simram came in this morning with part of the Hampton clip. My shop is completely cluttered up." It took half an hour to find the wool. If Betsy had not been within him, Robinson never would have got it. There she is. "It's that late. I must go home," said Betsy. "My Sam's on shore today for dinner. If you take my advice, you will leave that big heavy basket with Mrs. Goldfinch's and hurry with your shopping. It's a long uphill walk home to Piggery Porcombe." Robinson, anxious to follow old Betsy's advice, walked towards the Miss Goldfinch's. On the way, he came to a baker's, and he remembered the yeast. It was not the right sort of baker's, unfortunately. There was a nice bakery smell and pastry in the window, but it was an eating house or cook shop. When he pushed the swing door open, a man in an apron and a square white cap turned round and said, "Hello, is this a pork pie walking on its hind legs?" And 4 rude men at the dining table burst out laughing. Robinson left the shop in a hurry. He felt afraid to go into any other baker's shops. He was looking wistfully into another window in 4 Street when Stumpy saw him again. He had taken his own basket home and come out on another errand. He carried Robinson's basket in his mouth and took him to a very safe baker's, where he was accustomed to buy dog biscuits for himself. There, Robinson purchased Aunt Dorcas's yeast at last. They searched in vain for cabbage seed. They were told that the only likely place was a little store on the quay kept by a pair of wagtails. "It is a pity I cannot go with you," said Stumpy. "My Miss Rose has sprained her ankle. She sent me to fetch 12 postage stamps, and I must take them home to her." before the post goes out. Do not try to carry this heavy basket down and up the steps. Leave it with Miss Goldfinch's." Robinson was very grateful to Stumpy. The two Miss Goldfinches kept a tea and coffee tavern, which was patronized by Aunt Dorcas and the quieter market people. Over the door was a signboard upon which was painted a fat little green bird called the Contented Siskin, which was the name of their coffee tavern. They had a stable where the carrier's donkeys rested when it came into Stymouth, with the washing on Saturdays. Robinson looked so tired that the elder Miss Goldfinch gave him a cup of tea, but they both told him to drink it up quickly. "Wee, wee, wee, yuck, yuck," said Robinson, scalding his nose. In spite of their respect for Aunt Dorcas, the Miss Goldfinches disapproved of his solitary shopping, and they said that the basket was far too heavy for him. "Neither of us could lift it," said the elder Miss Goldfinch, holding out a tiny claw. "Get your cabbage seed and hurry back. Simram's pony gig is still waiting in our stable. If you come back before he starts, I feel sure he will give you a lift. At all events, he will make room for your basket under their seat, and he passes Piggery Porkum. Run away now." "Wee, wee, wee," said Robinson. "Whatever were they thinking of to let him come alone? He will never get home before dark," said the elder Miss Goldfinch. "Fly to the stable, Clara. Tell Simram's pony not to start without the basket." The younger Miss Goldfinch flew across the yard. They were industrious, sprightly little ladybirds who kept lump sugar and thistleseed as well as tea in their tea caddies. Their tables and china were spotlessly clean. Chapter 6. Stymouth was full of inns too full. The farmers usually put up their horses at the Black Bull or the Horse and Farrier. The smaller market people patronized the Pig and Whistle. There was another inn called the Crown and Anchor at the corner of the Fore Street. It was much frequented by seamen. Several were lounging about the door with their hands in their pockets. One sailor-man in a blue jersey sauntered across the road, staring very hard at Robinson. Said he, "I say, little pig, do you like snuff?" Now, if Robinson had a fault, it was that he could not say no, not even to a hedgehog stealing eggs. As a matter of fact, snuff or tobacco made him sick, but instead of saying, "No, thank you, Mr. Man," and going straight away about his business, he shuffled his feet, half closed one eye, hung his head on one side, and grunted. The sailor pulled out a horn of snuff box and presented a small pinch to Robinson, who wrapped it up in a little bit of paper, intending to give it to Aunt Dorcas. Then, not to be outdone in politeness, he offered the sailor-man some barley sugar. If Robinson was not fond of snuff, at all events, his new acquaintance had no objection to candy. He ate an alarming quantity. Then he pulled Robinson's ear and complimented him, and said he had 5 chins. He promised to take Robinson to the cabbage seed shop, and finally he begged to have the honor of showing him over a ship engaged in the ginger trade, commanded by Captain Barnabas Butcher and named the Pound of Candles. Robinson did not very much like the name. It reminded him of tallow, of lard, of crackle and trimmings, of bacon, but he allowed himself to be led away, smiling shyly and walking on his toes. If Robinson had only known that man was a ship's cook. As they turned down the steep, narrow lane out of High Street leading to the harbor, old Mr. Mumby at his shop door called out anxiously, "Robinson! Robinson!" But there was too much noise of carts, and a customer coming into the shop at that moment distracted his attention, and he forgot the suspicious behavior of the sailor. Otherwise, out of regard for the family, he would have undoubtedly ordered his dog Tipkins to go and fetch Robinson back. As it was, he was the first person to give useful information to the police when Robinson had been missed, but it was then too late. Robinson and his new friend went down the long flight of steps to the harbor basin, very high steps, steep and slippery. The little pig was obliged to jump from step to step until the sailor kindly took hold of him. They walked along the quay hand in hand. Their appearance seemed to cause unbounded amusement. Robinson looked about him with much interest. He had peeped over these steps before when he had come into Stymouth in the donkey cart, but he had never ventured to go down because the sailors are rather rough, and because they frequently have little snarling terriers on guard about their vessels. There were ever so many ships in the harbor. The noise and bustle was almost as loud as it had been above in the market square. A big 3-masted ship called the Goldilocks was discharging a cargo of oranges, and farther along the quay a small coasting brig called Little Bo Peep of Bristol was loading up with bales of wool belonging to the sheep of Hughampton and Lamworthy. Old Simram, with a sheep bell and big curly horns, stood by the gangway, keeping count of the bales. Every time the crane swung round and let down another bale of wool into the hold, with a scuffle of rope through the pulley, Simon Ram nodded his old head, and the bell went tinkle, tinkle, tong, and he gave a gruff bleat. Oop. There's poor Robinson and the ship's cook. He was a person who knew Robinson by sight and ought to have warned him. He had often passed Piggery Porkham when he drove down the lane in his gig, but his blind eye was turned towards the quay, and he had been flustered and confused by an argument with the pursers as to whether 35 bales of wool had been hoisted on board already or only 34. So he kept his one useful eye carefully on the wool and counted it by the notches on his tally stick. Another bale, another notch, 35, 36, 37. He hoped the number would come right out the finish. His bobtailed sheepdog, Timothy Gyp, was also acquainted with Robinson, but he was busy superintending a dog fight between an Airedale terrier belonging to the collier, Marjorie Daw, and a Spanish dog belonging to the Goldilocks. No one took any notice of their growling and snarling, which ended in both rolling over the side of the quay and falling into the water. Robinson kept close to the sailor and held his hand very tight. The pound of candles proved to be a good-sized schooner, newly painted and decorated with certain flags, whose significance was not understood by Robinson. She lay near the outer end of the jetty. The tide was running up fast, lapping against the ship's side and straining the thick hawsers by which she was moored to the quay. The crew were stowing goods on board and doing things with ropes under the direction of Captain Barnabas Butcher, a lean, brown, nautical person with a rasping voice. He banged things about and grumbled. Parts of his remarks were audible on the quay. He was speaking about the tug Seahorse, and about the spring tide with the northeast wind behind it, and the baker's man and fresh vegetables to be shipped at 11 sharp, likewise a joint of... He stopped short suddenly, and his eyes lighted upon the cook and Robinson. Robinson and the cook went on board across a shaky plank. When Robinson stepped onto the deck, he found himself face to face with a large yellow cat who was blacking boots. The cat gave a start of surprise and dropped its blacking brush. It then began to wink and make extraordinary faces at Robinson. He had never seen a cat behave in that way before. He inquired whether it was ill, whereupon the cook threw a boot at it, and it was rushed up into the rigging. But Robinson he invited most affably to descend into the cabin to partake of muffins and crumpets. I do not know how many muffins Robinson consumed. He went on eating them until he fell asleep, and he went on sleeping until his stool gave a lurch and he fell off and rolled under the table. One side of the cabin floor swung up to the ceilings, and the other side of the ceiling swung down to the floors. Plates danced about, and there were shoutings and thumpings and rattlings of chains and other bad sounds. Robinson picked himself up, feeling bumped. He scrambled up a sort of ladder staircase onto the deck. Then he gave a squeal upon squeal of horror. All round the ship there were great big green waves. The houses on the quay were like dolls' houses, and high up inland, above the red cliffs and green fields, he could see the farm of Piggery Porkham looking no bigger than a postage stamp. A little white patch on the orchard was Aunt Porkis's washing, spread out to bleach upon the grass. Near at hand, the black tug Seahorse smoked and plunged and rolled. They were winding in the tow rope, which had just been cast loose from the pound of candles. Captain Barnabas stood up on the bows of his schooner. He yelled and shouted to the master of the tug. The sailors shouted also, and pulled with a will, and hoisted the sails. The ship heeled over and rushed through the waves, and there was a smell of the sea. As for Robinson, he tore round and round the deck like one distracted, shrieking, very shrill and loud. Once or twice he slipped down, for the deck was extremely sideways, but still he ran and ran. Gradually his squeal subsided into singing, but still he kept on running, and this is what he sang. Poor pig Robinson Crusoe! Oh, how in the world could they do so? They have set him afloat in a horrible boat. Oh, poor pig Robinson Crusoe! The sailors laughed until they cried, but when Robinson had sung that same verse about 50 times and upset several sailors by rushing between their legs, they began to get angry. Even the ship's cook was no longer civil to Robinson. On the contrary, he was very rude indeed. He said that if Robinson did not leave off singing through his nose, he would make him into pork chops. Then Robinson fainted and fell flat upon the deck of the pound of candles.